Chapter 10. An Apostle by Proof. The careful student may discover in the destiny used men of all times a quality of some personality which suggests a truer philosophical basis of history than do the data arranged by either Buckle or Guizot. That quality is the ability of the actor in history not only to see the supreme opportunity when it is presented, but to rise to the height of its tests and requirements. This was the quality of Francis Asbury that stood him in the stead of genius. His sincerity of purpose and instant preparation of life were something more than the fruit of even religious loyalty. They were the manifestation of the spirit of history, the answer to the intelligent ordering and execution of the plans of providence. The doctrine of immanences would be a contradiction, an absurdity, if it could not vindicate itself in this way. Asbury had been slowly prepared for the supreme exigency in his life. Destiny was bound up in him, and the time was fast approaching. A Christmas conference, of which as yet no Methodist in Europe or America had dreamed, was about to be called. The time when a new and boldly conceived ecclesiasticism, with an apostolic and reversionary type of orders, was to emerge from the somewhat complicated conditions and relations of the Methodisms of the Old and the New World, was now but a matter of weeks. Asbury, who had created the possibilities upon which these things were predictable, was the pivot upon which their enactment was to turn. The picture seems red, even though I don't have the red light on. And I don't really see this red on the page like I do when I have the red light on. That's weird. Immediately after the Treaty of Peace, which gave independence to the American colonies, Mr. Wesley was able to read the necessity for a new and democratic ecclesiasticism befitting the spirit of the young republic. America's always been a republic, not a democracy. But in this, as in all his enterprises, he moved slowly and took out but one step at a time. He had long had a desire to visit America in person, but the 7 years of war had put that thought behind him. He was now advanced in years, much beyond 80, and must needs commit to another the offices in which he would fain himself have served his children beyond the Atlantic. Early in 1784, he settled upon Dr. Thomas Coke, a Welshman by birth, a graduate of Oxford, and an ordained clergyman of the Church of England. For this work, Coke was not only the son of a family of high social rank, but he had inherited an ample fortune. Possessed of a naturally ambitious spirit, he entered politics on leaving the university, but soon took orders and was settled as curate in a Middle English parish. He expected to rise to distinction in the establishment, and would no doubt have done so, but was convicted of sin under his own preaching, and on seeking the aid of a Methodist class leader, found easement of his burden, and began to preach with evangelical fervor and directness. He was at once accused of being a Methodist and was shortly afterwards dismissed from his curacy. But with little delay, he visited Mr. Wesley, whom he had not before seen. His gifts, learning, and deep religious experience at once commended him to the now aged leader of Methodism, who had long been looking about for a successor to be trained for leadership under his own eye. At one time he thought to lay this responsibility on Fletcher, his saintly associate, but Fletcher could never be brought to consent to the arrangement. At glance, Wesley saw in Coke the man divinely proclaimed. He was under 30 years of age, bore the seal of the Spirit, and had been, like himself, thrust out to learn the will of God in persecutions and afflictions. He therefore at once invited Coke to meet the preachers in conference, and from that day to the end of Wesley's life, no man was so much in his counsels as the gifted Welshman. It's important to have a movement that brings people in that seem to be of the same type, without having been trained by that movement. Sometimes some movements really don't have, particular spiritual organizations, some just don't have that. The subject of the mission to America was broached to Coke as early as February of 1784. It was then that Wesley first expounded to him his long-settled belief that as a presbyter he had, according to usage in the primitive church, the same right to ordain that he had to administer the sacraments, and explained that in view of his failure to secure relief from the bishops of the establishment, he felt justified in exercising his scriptural right to provide ordained ministers for the societies in America. The simple and unconventional proposition, therefore, was that Dr. Coke should accept from Wesley's hands ordination to the episcopacy and proceed with that authority to America to ordain a ministry and superintend the societies. The suggestion was at first received by Coke with misgivings. By April the same year he had, however, reached a favorable state of mind, and while expressing doubts as to his fitness for the work, submitted himself to authority. At the Wesleyan Conference for the year, which met at Leeds in August, the matter of the mission was concluded, though the question of ordination was left open. The preachers were not favorable to the idea, but for that Mr. Wesley considered himself solely responsible. Dr. Coke, Richard Watcote, and Thomas Vassie were selected for the American work, and he began at once to make preparations for their voyage. After the conference, Mr. Wesley repaired to Bristol, and Dr. Coke set off for London. Some days later he addressed a letter to Mr. Wesley, fully accepting his views with reference to the proposed ordination, and expressed the opinion that his mission could be satisfactorily accomplished under no less authority than that which Mr. Wesley had offered to confer. The result of this letter was that Mr. Wesley wrote to Coke, asking him his immediate presence in Bristol and directing him to bring with him the Reverend Mr. Crichton, a presbyter of the Church of England who had often preached in the London chapels and who was in complete accord with Wesley's work and policies. On the arrival of Dr. Coke and Mr. Crichton in Bristol, Wesley reviewed the arguments for the step he was about to take, which arguments he had pondered for more than a score of years, and then, with the assistance of the two clergymen, ordained Richard Whatcoat and Thomas Vassey presbyters for America, being particularly attached to every rite of the Church of England. He thereafter, with the assistance of Crichton, ordained Dr. Coke superintendent or bishop for the work in America, and gave him letters of ordination under his hand and seal. Now, if you remember from the New Testament, the only limit to one wife in Christianity, basic Christianity that is, fundamentalist Christianity, is that bishops are limited to one wife. So before people of lower or higher rank can have multiples, in this act, the founder of Methodism contradicted the prejudices of a lifetime to follow the straightly marked path of Providence in the office of consecrator. He acted not as the churchman, but as the efficient agent of a history that had come to the point of its outgoing. He was impelled to an act which, though he had appraised and judged it in advance, he was at little pains to publicly vindicate. That was for all future times to do. He was shut up to do what he did. The reasons in hand and the logic of history were sufficient. The results were to pass to other years and other generations. Now, the self-correcting soul. It's not that you just, reject and move on, reject and move on, and it's that you're willing to correct yourself at any stage in life. That you're willing to bring out more of a tradition. Or, by bring out, I mean that you've found something more about it that you're supposed to pick up. It's said that at the end times, religion will be like a cloth, and the people will take parts of the cloth, and they'll have problems, not because of the religion, but because of that they're only taking parts of the religion and they're leaving others. They're deliberately leaving others. It's one thing, neglect by some other reasons, but to intentionally, that's technically the definition when you divide the difference between liberal and conservative and reformist and fundamentalist, is that a liberal will, as they will take and leave pieces. I don't mean anything political by the statement, It thus happens that the orders and authority of the ministry of Episcopal Methodism rest upon both an apostolic and historic basis. The type is demonstrably apostolic, and the historic identification is both successional and instant in historic necessity. They are, in fact, the recovery and restoration of those simple apostolic methods and functions which were displaced by constrained interpretations of the Evangel. The status of Methodist ordinations in the three offices of the ministry is forever settled, in the logic of which these statements are a brief setting forth. The hierarchical cavil and opposition has multiplied itself into unprofitable volumes, but the canons of Methodism settled in history and providence are beyond repeal, and find a larger vindication every year. But large as were the reasonings which guided the mind of Wesley in planning for a new ecclesiastical order in America, and wholly as he rested in the certainty of the divine approval. The human center of his confidence was the personality of Francis Asbury. The whole scheme of the organization, so far as any details were anticipated, revolved around that personality. And when the hour of determination came, it was found that the weight and influence of that personality were supreme. This was unquestionably the scale of the Petrine primacy. In the apostolic community, it was not hierarchical or ecclesiastical presidency, but the ascendancy of personality. Personality is the basis of the priesthood of history. A writer from whom I have already quoted sketches a picture of Asbury as he stood amongst his brethren at the moment Wesley was shaping to a conclusion his plans for settlement of the societies in the New World, and only a few months before the arrival of Coke bearing the Magna Charta of American Methodism. This writer says, among the pioneers, Asbury, by common consent, stood first and chief. There was something in his person, his eye, his mien, and in the music of his voice, which interested all who heard him. He possessed much natural wit and was capable of the severest satire, but grace and good sense so far predominated that he never descended to anything beneath the dignity of a man and a Christian. This was the figure which, to the vision of Wesley, loomed large in the foreground and of the possibilities of Methodism in America. It was faith in this man that led him to consent to so large an independency for the societies and to so radical a departure for their government. Dr. Coke, in company with his associates, Watcote and Vassy, arrived in New York on November 3rd, 1784. No official information concerning their mission had been sent to America, and the arrival of the missionaries was, in consequence, unexpected. Mr. Asbury, who, after the conference held at Baltimore in the previous spring, had ridden through the Valley of Virginia and parts of Pennsylvania, had been in New York as late as September. But his stay had been short and was now touring through the ever fruitful districts of the peninsula. While in New York, he had learned through letters received from England by John Dickens, the preacher in charge, something of the plans of Mr. Wesley, and he had also had an inclination of the coming of Dr. Coke, but the information was too indefinite to more than feed a hope that sometime, possibly soon, the help so long prayed for by the societies would come. He had not even attempted to forecast the character of the relief to be provided. Immediately on his arrival in New York, Dr. Coke disclosed the secret of his commission to Dickens, and that well-taught and enthusiastic reformer advised him to proclaim it at once. But the legate of Wesley could only reply that Mr. Asbury was first to be most respectfully consulted concerning every part of the plan and its execution. He accordingly, after a very brief delay, set out to seek Mr. Asbury in the south, where, like another Elijah, his hand was upon the plough in the furrowed field. The first stage of the journey ended at Philadelphia, where a short stop was made, and where Dr. Coke was cordially received not only by the members of the society, but also by two resident Episcopal clergymen, Dr. McGaw, who had cooperated with Asbury in Delaware, and Dr. White, who afterwards became the Protestant Episcopal Bishop of Pennsylvania. Pushing on southward, Coke and his two companions came on November 14th, 10 days after their debarkation at New York, to Barrett's Chapel, a country preaching place where the famous meeting between Coke and Asbury occurred. Asbury had learned of Dr. Coke's arrival and also of his southern progress and had set out to meet him. Barrett's Chapel was a brick structure and the most pretentious country meeting house of the Methodists in America. It was Sunday and the occasion of a quarterly meeting. A noble congregation was present. Additional advertising having been done when it was discovered that so distinguished a preacher was to be present. Now, you should really attend the sermons in the houses and the places of worship and services and that sort of stuff, regardless of the personality that's leading, or not attend them, When Asbury reached the chapel, the service was already well advanced, so that he had no opportunity to speak to Dr. Coke until the conclusion of the sermon. The communion was celebrated, and Asbury was greatly surprised to see Whatcoat, whom he supposed to be only a lay preacher, take the cup in the administration. When the service was over, a memorable scene occurred, in which it is effectively described in Coke's own words. After the sermon, a plain, robust man came up to me in the pulpit and kissed me, and I thought it could be no other than Mr. Asbury, and in this I was not deceived. An eyewitness says that the other preachers were melted by the scene into sweet sympathy and tears, and that the whole assembly, as if struck with the shock of heavenly electricity, burst into a flood of tears.